Alright, hello. So what we're going to be talking about in today's video is what happened on the Australian home front. So the home front is a term that we use when we're referring to kind of like the civilian experience, what was happening during the wars. So why the home front was important during the First World War was this was also the first time in which Australia had entered a total war scenario. So that meant that all of our industry, all of our resources, and all of our citizens were trying to do as much as they could to support our troops overseas. And so a few of the ways that they do this was we introduced rationing for the first time throughout Australia to ensure that we could free up as much of our food and culinary resources for our servicemen that we could. So this was also a lot of the first time that people were then getting very conscious of what they were eating, as we were also at this point in our country and our kind of like industries in which we did have a greater range of food in a long time. What would also be happening, because this was a total war kind of moment, was you couldn't really get through the day without being reminded of the war at some point, whether it was a recruiting agent, posters asking you for asking you to buy war bonds, which was a special type of bond in which you could buy during the war, to pretty much, it was just kind of like to support the war in a greater effort through a greater way, and you're kind of buying stocks in the war in a weird way. So since you'd be sitting through and you kind of like, the war was constantly on your mind, because a war of this scale and with this many troops being sent overseas, everyone knew someone. No matter where you were in the country, you knew someone who was at war, and you most definitely by the end of it knew someone who died for it. So during assembly, students and teachers would be updated on the war, and then not only that, greater attention would be paid to past pupils or even current pupils when this was in high school, as there were a lot of boys who'd lied about their age and said they were 16, who said they were 18 when they were in fact 16, and so they kind of snuck their way into the trenches, which is a really intense thing when you think about it, because those are people almost your age who are going off to fight for their country in a country that they've never been or never really heard much about. And so because the country was still quite new as well, we didn't have the facilities, in a sense, to really support the war effort at this scale. So what had happened was there were a lot of fundraisers being done within schools to support the war effort. So students would actually be knitting socks and jumpers and other warmer clothing for our Australian troops, and we'd send them over in what was called the Australian Comfort Fund. So this was ways in which we could also show that the citizens and everyone back at home really was supporting what was happening over in Europe and on the Eastern Front, and really kind of like going and gifting them things that weren't really supplied to them. So these were things that were either going to keep them warmer. Socks were always in short supply, especially when you're standing in the trenches all day, and gangrene was such a common feat, and one of the easiest ways to prevent gangrene is just foot care and just cleaning your feet and wearing new socks. So a lot of these a lot of the soldiers in the trenches were really, really grateful to receive a nice pair of socks that had been knitted for them by Australians back home, which was always like a really nice treat. So while this was also happening, and we were putting together the Australian Comfort Fund, and we were really supporting our troops through fundraisers, what a lot of other women had elected to do is, what was very common was a lot of suffragettes as well had gone forth with kind of this white feather campaign. So it was led by women that would end up shaming men for not being a part of the war effort and physically pinning a white feather, hence the name, to their clothing as a kind of like a sign of cowardness, or kind of like chicken, or like being a chicken. And so one of the bigger reasons that this became such a large thing was in 1916 we saw a steady decline in our enlistment as the initial excitement of the war had kind of settled down, and the stories of the fronts and the death tolls had made their way back to Australia. A lot more men were kind of losing their interest, or in a sense motivation, to head out to war, because why would you want to go somewhere in which you already knew that the chances of you dying or suffering was very high? Because what was also happening was, as part of being in a state of total war, the roles of censorship on our newspapers was becoming quite prevalent, in the sense that we weren't, as a country, going to publish official death tolls that had happened in the war, although private citizens could in fact publish specific eulogies for either for their sons, their fathers, their brothers. And so it got to the point in which these newspapers were becoming densely thick with just eulogy after man lost. And so what had becoming was the external pressures to enlist were building, as they were being shamed in the street. Men of fighting fit were not only being harassed, they were being shamed, they were being yelled at, and then also the standard that Australian was having was dropping. So what we can see here in these two stimuli is that of kind of the women of Britain say go. And we can see these two women standing in the windowsill looking out to about 4 men physically marching off through the countryside down into the trenches. Now, while this is a Women of Britain and kind of a British poster, it was very true for also Australia, as we still had such a connection to Britain and like to the empire and to the countries in which had come before us, as we were still such a young country at being barely 14, 16 years old, as our federation had happened in 1901, as you all know. So if we also look over to our stimulus just over on this side, we can see up in the right corner, left-hand corner, we can see suddenly producing a large white feather. She jabbed it into his waistcoat, and in another tone, fiercely and scornfully, she added, "You coward, why won't you enlist?" So what we can also see here is these are modern women, just from kind of like the silhouette that they're wearing, from like that tight silhouette that's really kind of like holding them in. That's not really a silhouette of kind of like a proper established lady. These women are suffragettes, and these women are like radical, they're pushing forward, they need men to enlist because we need men fighting for our country all the way over in Europe. And so while the White Feather campaign was also going, especially in 1916, we saw this great movement as arguing as to why we didn't have conscription. Now, conscription is the compulsory enlistment of men, and every other country had conscription but Australia. So it was quite decisive in that way. Australia was also struggling to keep up with the demand of soldiers that Britain was requesting, as they turned to all of their colonies and gone, you need to defend Britain. We are kind of like your parental figure in kind of this country commonwealth. Or you really need to kind of help us fight, because we are fighting for peace in Europe. And Europe is kind of your homeland, as we still had so many with like their British tries. And as we've said in previous videos, we still sung the British national anthem. We still looked to the Queen, we still looked to the King, sorry, as we had a king at the time, as kind of like that peak of Australian governments. And so what had also happened was this war had further divided the classes of Australia, as the working class and those who were part of all of our trade unions had felt like they had more men going to the war and kind of like enlisting than that did of kind of the upper class. And so this led to large arguments as why should one class be producing and supplying more men than another kind of thing. So what had happened in 1916, in October, we had the plebiscite for conscription, which was done by our PM at the time, Billy Hughes. And what had happened was it was very close. I think it was about 49 to 51% voting no. So we wouldn't have conscription at the time. And we would rather continue. Those men who wanted to enlist would enlist, and those men who were shamed into enlisting would also enlist. Whether or not it was by internal or external pressures, it wasn't by a government mandated thing. And so then again, in late 1917, Australia was still facing this large issue of we couldn't produce or provide the men that Britain and the lines were needing. So again, Billy Hughes turned to Australia and goes, we need your votes. Will you be should we have conscription for a second time? A bold move, as we'd already said no, although there was some hope that we'd gone later into the war, we were seeing kind of the shift in powers a bit more. Maybe Australia would say yes this time. So what we can also see in this, I've added a pro-conscription and an anti-conscription type of posters. So up on the right, we'll start with the anti-conscription. We can see that this little boy is running to his mother and begging her, don't vote no, don't send dad away, because they'd agreed that they wouldn't let married men enlist as part of conscription, although they could enlist on their own merit. So we can see very bold letters. They do not want you to vote. They want you to vote no. It's stated there twice. We can also see that this is probably a child of higher standing, as he is dressed in a bit more of a modern fashion. He's got shoes, he's got socks on, and he's also got that little cape that we saw a lot more in the upper class than that of the working classes or the middle class of Australians. So we can really see that this was an issue, that conscription was an issue that spanned all classes, not just working class feared it. But we can also see if the working class feel like they're pushing the most amount of men into the war, they were still very anti-conscription, and so they were also trying to kind of encourage the other classes to know that we shouldn't be forcing men to join a war if they don't want to. And so then to the right, to the other side, we have a pro-conscription banner. We have a pro-conscription poster, and we can see that because it is our adversaries, our enemies, and they're smiling and they're enjoying the fact that they're knowing Australia has voted no, and we will not be sending compulsory numbers of troops overseas to fight them, which implies that our numbers will be lower and our enlistments will be lower and we will be an easier target to fight. And so we can see the German Kaiser, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire all standing there eagerly knowing that Australia will not be an adversary worth of note because we voted no. There is basically no worth in needing us. Like, Australia's almost in an effort gone to their side, and we've abandoned us because we won't support our own troops back overseas. So I know that's a lot to cover, and I believe in you all will get through it, but it's a lot to think about. So really think about how the home front and kind of what we were doing back home while our men were overseas.